He placed his hand on the marble counter, and within seconds, the teller slapped it away like swatting something filthy. No questions asked, no eye contact, just pure dismissal wrapped in a cold, white glove of authority. A black man in a gray coat, silent, respectful, stood in a bank built on glass and gold, and was treated like he'd wandered in through the wrong door of America. No raised voice, no resistance, just the slow erosion of dignity as a manager glanced at his shoes and asked if he was looking for the charity office down the street. They didn't care who he was. They didn't even ask. They saw skin, not stature. They saw threat, not identity. And the moment you think it couldn't get worse, someone tosses him a janitor recruitment flyer on his way out. What happened inside that building would have been just another day in a long, ugly pattern, until everything changed. If you think you've seen power turn the tables before, you haven't seen this. This story doesn't just expose prejudice, it buries it, rebuilds over it, and hands the blueprint to the ones they tried to erase. Hit like if injustice makes your blood boil, subscribe so you don't miss the full unraveling, and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Because stories like this aren't just stories. They're a mirror, and this one reflects more than anyone expected. The morning sun gleamed against the bronze sign of Grayson and Truett Bank, a symbol of old money and older prejudice. Eldrick Van walked in, shoulders squared, a worn leather satchel brushing against his side, the rhythm of his steps steady on the marble floors. He moved with the quiet dignity of someone who knew how to listen, observe, and endure. But he also moved with the hesitation of someone who knew what could happen in places like this. He stepped toward the private banking counter, where the air smelled faintly of polished wood, citrus cleaner, and superiority. Behind the frosted glass window sat Colette Granger, her platinum blonde hair pinned high, her expression tight with disinterest. She looked up as Eldrick approached, her eyes scanning him from the shoes up, creased Oxfords, khaki trousers, sport coat 1 season out of date. Her lips parted not to greet, but to frown. As he reached into his bag, pulling out a ledger and a folder of identification documents, he placed them gently on the marble counter in front of her. Without a word, Colette slapped his hand back with the back of her fingers, swift, dismissive, like swatting away an insect. Eldrick didn't flinch. He simply blinked once. Colette, without acknowledging him, reached for a sanitizing wipe from her drawer and scrubbed the counter exactly where his fingers had touched. She wiped with the intensity of someone erasing a stain. When she finished, she dropped the tissue in the trash and finally looked him in the eye. "This window is for private account holders only," she said, each syllable clipped. "I have an appointment," Eldrick replied, his voice measured. "With Mr. Jorick. 9:15. She didn't check. She leaned forward slightly, her mouth curving in a smirk. "Do you need an interpreter?" Her voice dropped into something rehearsed, but mocking. "Or are you comfortable navigating this in English?" Eldrick's jaw moved, but he said nothing. "Not yet. If you'll come back with the proper documentation," she continued, voice rising slightly so that a nearby client could hear, "we may be able to assist. Legal residency forms, tax certification, that kind of thing." Her eyes didn't blink. "We take compliance seriously." Eldrick slid one of the documents across the glass, his name clearly printed on an embossed letterhead from Van Trust Holdings, sealed in blue. She didn't touch it. She stood, smoothed her skirt, and walked away. 10 minutes passed. No one came. A junior teller, eyes wide with discomfort, glanced over but said nothing. Colette eventually returned and waved toward the seating area with 2 fingers, not speaking. Eldrick picked up his papers and moved to the waiting chairs, small, hard, uncomfortable, deliberately placed near the security desk, away from the coffee service and away from comfort. As he sat, a guard walked by slowly, hand brushing the taser at his hip. Eldrick met his gaze, unflinching. The man stopped for a second, then moved on. From her desk, Colette watched without blinking, as though daring him to speak up. Behind her, another teller whispered something and laughed. Time stretched. No one offered water. No one asked if he was being helped. Eventually, the branch manager appeared. Lyndon Jorick, a tall man with a head of hair more wax than strand, marched out of his glass office. His gaze not on Eldrick, but on Colette. "Problem?" he asked. He says he's here to initiate a trust transfer, she replied, eyes narrowing. Doesn't have any of the usual clearances. Lyndon approached Eldrick, lips pursed as though bracing against a foul scent. Mr. Van Isite. Eldrick nodded. Yes. Lyndon squinted, tilted his head. Forgive my bluntness, but we do have standards of presentation here. Next time, it might help to dress the part. Eldrick raised one eyebrow, but didn't speak. This is a highly confidential environment, Lyndon continued, and unfortunately, without prior relationship verification, we cannot process speculative requests. He had experienced dismissal before, but this wasn't just bureaucratic coldness. It was curated, practiced, and sharpened like a blade. Before he could reach the doors, Lyndon Jorick reappeared from his office, walking with the stiff confidence of a man who had never been second-guessed in his domain. Wait, Lyndon said, raising a hand and stopping Eldrick mid-step. You mentioned a trust. You said you had something to transfer. Eldrick turned, holding the manila folder loosely in one hand. Yes, he said evenly. Lyndon's eyes dropped again to Eldrick's clothing. The jacket was pressed but worn at the seams, the slacks outdated in their cut, and the shoes bore scuff marks that bespoke use, not poverty. But neither did they speak wealth. I see, Lyndon muttered, adjusting his silk tie. Because you don't exactly fit the profile of our clientele. Eldrick didn't respond, but his silence only encouraged the man to continue. No offense, of course, Lyndon added, voice dipped in false courtesy. But from a risk assessment standpoint, the optics are irregular. If someone walked in here dressed like that, he gestured vaguely, claiming control over significant capital, we'd be negligent not to raise red flags. A beat of silence passed. Eldrick remained unmoving. Then, under the pretense of casual authority, Lyndon chuckled and asked, You're not lost, are you? The public relief office is 2 blocks down, unless you took a wrong turn from county services. Somewhere behind them, near the customer service desk, 2 security officers stood watching. One of them, a younger man with a jawline sharp enough to cut glass, leaned in and whispered something to his colleague. Whatever it was, it drew a snort of laughter. The other one, broader and older, glanced at Eldrick and said loud enough for it to carry, He's probably here for a warm place to sit. Maybe they thought this was a day's shelter. The first security guard nodded, still laughing, and added, Or maybe he's working the long con. You know the type, worn briefcase, calm tone, fancy talk, trying to act like old money. It's cute, really. Their mockery wasn't hidden. It was theatrical, performed not in whispers, but in loud enough fragments to humiliate with plausible deniability. Lyndon heard them. He didn't reprimand. He didn't flinch. Instead, he crossed his arms and shifted his weight, as if satisfied. Eldrick's eyes narrowed slightly. Not in anger, not even in hurt. It was something else, measured recognition. This wasn't simply about race or status or appearances. It was about what people like Lyndon had built their confidence on. The belief that they could always tell who mattered and who didn't. If you'd like to wait, Lyndon said, gesturing back toward the waiting area with its stiff chairs and security camera posted above, I can have someone skim the documents. But I'll be frank, unless it's something immediate and credible, I'd suggest scheduling an appointment with our public representative next door. He emphasized the word public like it was code for people who didn't belong here. Eldrick didn't move. Instead, he finally reached into his folder and pulled out a second envelope, sealed and stamped with the insignia of Valmont Estate law. Lyndon recognized it instantly. The gold insignia carried weight in financial circles. He blinked. Once, twice, then cleared his throat. Where exactly did you say you were from? He asked, voice changing. Eldrick said nothing. He simply let the envelope rest in his hand. But the moment to redeem himself passed. Lyndon didn't apologize. Instead, he stiffened and gestured once more. I'll have someone glance through it. But no promises, he said. Then, turning back toward his office, he called to a young intern who had just emerged from the copier room. Wesley, he barked. We've got a walk-in with a supposed trust file. Scan it, then drop it to compliance. He didn't say client. He didn't say Mr. Van. Just walk in. Wesley approached hesitantly, glancing at Eldrick, then at the envelope, then back to Lyndon. He took it without a word and disappeared. Eldrick remained standing. The ones who had once ignored him now stole glances, but not curious ones, cautious ones, as if proximity to him might rub off and smudge the surface of their elite world. A door at the far end opened with a mechanical hum. From it stepped Devlin Maris, senior investment liaison, a man who looked as if he had been tailored into his role. Slicked back hair, graying at the temples, skin taut with discipline, and a navy pinstripe suit that practically sparkled beneath the ambient lighting. He approached with the expression of someone asked to examine something unpleasant left on the sidewalk. "So," Devlin said, glancing down at the papers handed off to him, "you're the one requesting a full liquidation report on a dormant trust, and no legal representation." Eldrick nodded once. "Everything is authorized in writing." Devlin flipped through the documents with deliberate slowness, each page turned with the theatricality of disinterest. After a few seconds, he stopped. "This can't be real," he said, then looked up. "You're telling me this trust belongs to you?" Eldrick didn't answer the question. He let the silence return. Devlin scoffed, then chuckled softly. Let me put it in simple terms. People with access to these kinds of assets don't walk into branch lobbies with leather folders and second-hand shoes. They have representatives, lawyers, handlers. They're discreet. You, he motioned lazily at Eldrick's appearance, look like someone who found a briefcase on the street and thought they could play banker for the day. He handed the documents back without further review. "Tell you what, why don't you take this to legal verification across the street? That's the office that handles complicated inheritance claims and offshore identity issues. They deal with non-standard cases." The emphasis on non-standard did not go unnoticed. Eldrick took the documents slowly, slid them back into the folder without comment. Colette returned to her station a moment later, holding a clipboard and a printed form. "Sir," she said crisply, "since you mentioned you were transferring funds internationally, we'll need immigration documentation. Here." She handed the form across the glass. It was the standard declaration form for non-residents and foreign nationals, a form not even remotely relevant to Eldrick's request. You'll need to provide proof of legal entry and residency status, as well as tax filings for the last 3 years. She didn't even try to mask the implication. Devlin added with a smirk, "And if you're claiming U.S. citizenship, we'll need something stronger than a driver's license." Eldrick stood there holding the form, not because he needed it, but because refusing it would feed their narrative. He looked at it, read every line, memorized it, then folded it neatly in half and slid it into the pocket of his coat. Across the room, the security guard who had laughed earlier was now sipping coffee from a paper cup, eyes still fixed on him. The man's gaze wasn't curious. It was watchful, like a dog waiting for a command. Eldrick turned back toward the front of the lobby. As he passed, Colette's voice followed him. It's not uncommon for people to falsify documentation, especially when they come from unstable economies. There are protocols to protect the institution. Eldrick kept walking. Devlin's voice rose just enough to reach him. You can always try a credit union. They tend to be more flexible. Laughter. Not loud, but sharp enough to cut. Eldrick passed a decorative water feature near the entrance, its surface still and clear like glass. He paused, glancing at his reflection, not to check his posture, not to adjust his coat, but to observe the face that had been judged so quickly, so cruelly. His skin, his age, his composure, they had seen none of that. They had only seen what they expected to see, and they had acted exactly as he'd predicted. Because this wasn't about proof. It wasn't about policy. It was about permission. Who was allowed to belong? Who was allowed to carry money and authority and presence? Eldrick had not been given that permission, so they tried to take it. But what they didn't know was that the permission they assumed they owned had never been theirs to grant. They mistook his silence for submission, mistook his patience for ignorance, mistook his civility for weakness. He had not been offered a chair, nor a time estimate, nor even the decency of acknowledgement, since Devlin Maris dismissed him with a laugh and handed his paperwork off to an intern whose name he hadn't been given. The clock above the concierge desk ticked loudly in his mind now, not for what it represented in minutes, but in weight, the mass of every microaggression, every deliberate delay, every gesture meant to remind him that he was not part of this place and would never be. He stood, folder clutched loosely in one hand, back straight, breathing measured, not because he was unbothered, but because he refused to feed their narrative. To them, the longer he stood there without speaking, the more they believed they were right, that he wasn't a client. He was a disruption. When he finally moved, it was only a few steps forward, toward the desk where Colette now sat typing slowly, the corners of her mouth pulled into a smirk just subtle enough to deny. He didn't ask for a manager or raise his voice. He simply asked, with restraint carved into every word, if there had been an update on his documents. Colette didn't stop typing. "Still being reviewed," she said with feigned indifference. "These things take time. You can't rush protocol, especially with complex cases." He waited for more, but she said nothing else. Then, after a deliberate pause, she glanced at him and added, "Besides, this isn't a charity. We can't prioritize people just because they've decided to loiter here for an hour." She looked him over again with that same sharp-edged stare. "Do you even know what time it is?" Eldrick didn't respond. He didn't need to. Her words had already done their work, public, loud enough for a nearby teller to lift an eyebrow, quiet enough to pretend it wasn't meant to humiliate. And still, he remained composed. He didn't shift his weight. He didn't avert his gaze. That kind of dignity was foreign to people like Colette, who had built their understanding of power on who could be silenced and who could be made to shrink. Moments later, as he turned to leave, because he had been given no alternative, no appointment, no promise of follow-up, a young employee with a trainee badge passed him near the exit. The boy couldn't have been older than 22, his shirt slightly wrinkled, confidence brittle with inexperience. He didn't speak at first, but then, with a smirk that mirrored the culture that had trained him, he pulled a trifold pamphlet from his stack and tossed it toward Eldrick with a flick of the wrist. "Thought you might be interested," he said, loud enough for a few heads to turn. The pamphlet fluttered once before landing face up on the floor. It read, "Evening janitorial openings, flexible hours, entry-level welcome." Eldrick looked at it. He did not stoop to pick it up. The trainee had already turned his back, laughing to himself. Across the lobby, someone else chuckled, not cruelly, but reflexively, as though participating in an inside joke whose rules they had long accepted. Eldrick didn't move, not for a moment, not for them. The insult wasn't surprising. In fact, it had been inevitable. What stung wasn't the flyer itself, but the ease with which it had been thrown, the sheer effortlessness of their condescension. The assumption wasn't that he didn't belong, it was that he could be safely mocked without consequence. As he finally turned from the lobby and stepped through the glass doors into the morning air, the city outside greeted him with the same cool indifference, the traffic and sunlight unaware of the quiet war he'd fought inside. But Eldrick wasn't just leaving, he was documenting, cataloging, memorizing each name, each face, each voice. Not in anger, in precision. Because there is a kind of fury more dangerous than rage. A fury disciplined by time and intellect and restraint. A fury that waits. He paused on the steps outside, folder still in hand, coat now flaring slightly in the wind that tugged at the hem. He looked back once, not with regret, but with finality. Eldrick turned, walked down the block, circled the corner, and re-entered the bank through its adjoining cafe entrance, smaller, quieter, often used by wealth clients and executives taking informal meetings. There, behind a glass divider lined with lush palms and gold-plated signage, was the Prestige Client Suite, a reserved lounge for high-net-worth clients requiring discretion. The guard by the entrance didn't notice him at first, distracted by his tablet. Eldrick stood just close enough to observe, his gaze calm and deliberate. Inside the suite, a white man in a slate-blue blazer sat comfortably at a marble-top table. He sipped espresso served in porcelain, browsed a tablet, and smiled faintly while two employees hovered nearby, one taking notes, the other offering refreshments on a silver tray. The air was warm and respectful around him. It shimmered with a low murmur of privilege, the kind born from appearance alone. That man hadn't presented identification. He hadn't waited in line. He simply existed with the ease of someone born into trust. Just as Eldrick continued to observe, a member of the cafe staff brushed past him and said over her shoulder, polite but firm, "Sir, this section is restricted. Please wait outside." She didn't ask why he was there. She didn't check credentials. She only saw someone who did not match the carpet. Eldrick stepped back slowly and asked, evenly, if he could get a glass of water. Her reply came without hesitation. "We only serve refreshments to clients seated in designated areas." He glanced to the left, where a few low chairs sat near the side corridor, unattended, uncleaned, as if designed to remind those sitting there that they were an afterthought. Eldrick gave a small nod, turned, and began to walk toward the exit again. As he did, one of the bank's security officers, a man he hadn't seen earlier, stepped into his path. He was younger than the others, tall, lean, skin pale and unwrinkled, but with eyes already hardened from habitual suspicion. The guard didn't speak at first. He merely stood too close. Then he leaned in, the scent of aftershave thick and synthetic, and whispered, "We know your kind. Don't push it." The words were quiet, but the threat inside them clung like oil. Eldrick met his eyes, unmoving, and the guard stepped back half a pace as if surprised by the lack of reaction. "This place's rules," the guard continued, quieter now. "You don't just walk around where you don't belong. Play it smart. Walk away." Eldrick said nothing. He simply breathed in through his nose and held the air in his lungs for 3 seconds, long enough to remember the moment. The glass doors parted behind him as another customer walked through. She was older, sharply dressed in emerald silk, and glanced once at Eldrick before offering the kind of smile that pretended to be polite but shrank with distance. Eldrick stepped aside. She didn't thank him. Inside, the laughter returned, not directed at him, but made sharper by contrast. Somewhere near the service desk, the younger security guard from earlier joked loudly about street hustlers with briefcases, earning another round of chuckles from staff too busy to hide their biases. Eldrick moved once more through the lobby, not rushed, not withdrawn. The front desk manager glanced up and turned quickly away. A tall man in a Brioni suit had just arrived and was being greeted with champagne flutes and business cards. He was led, smiling, to the same lounge Eldrick had just been denied access to. They hadn't checked his documents either. They hadn't asked if he had an appointment. They didn't need to. He looked the part. That was enough. Eldrick returned to the central atrium and stood beside a polished column, folder still in hand. He made no attempt to hide, no attempt to fade. His presence was now deliberate, not for confrontation, but for calculation. He saw how people shifted their weight when they noticed him, some subtle, others overt. A young teller reached for the phone, glanced at him, then changed her mind. An assistant manager from upstairs peered down from the mezzanine, watching without stepping forward. And still, no one spoke to him, not to apologize, not to explain, not to offer assistance. Because to acknowledge him now would require admitting the system had failed, admitting that their assumption of superiority had been based on nothing but surface and skin. And that kind of admission would never come from them willingly. The voice that answered was automatic and detached. "Welcome to Grayson and Truitt's Wealth Management Services. Please enter your client verification ID." He did, slowly, precisely. A pause. Then a voice, clipped and pre-recorded, directed him to press further options. Each choice led to another corridor of corporate indifference. Press 1 for account access. Press 2 for trust inquiries. Press 3 to speak to a relationship manager. He pressed 3. A moment later, music. Not a melody meant to soothe, but a looping chime designed to occupy, not resolve. He waited. 3 minutes passed. Then 5. Then a voice, a human one at last. Female, young and scripted. "Thank you for holding. May I verify your full name and account purpose?" Eldrick gave both. Her response was too quick, her tone already moving on. "Can you hold while I transfer you to the trust department?" He answered yes. The music resumed, then stopped mid-note. Another voice picked up, this one male, deep, disinterested. "Trust services, name please." Eldrick repeated himself, slower this time. The man asked for a reference number. Eldrick provided the one stamped on the folder. A pause followed, then a cough. That account is not showing on my system. You might have the wrong extension. I'll redirect you. Before Eldrick could protest, the line clicked and redirected, not to a department, but back to the main menu. He tried again. He re-entered the number, re-verified his ID, and was transferred, this time to someone in operations who claimed to have no visibility over private trusts. That's a separate division, she said, cheerful but useless. And I'm not authorized to provide updates. She offered no solution, only the phrase, try again later. He asked to be escalated. She said she couldn't. When he insisted, the call dropped. No click, no goodbye, just a void. He stared at the screen for 3 seconds, then placed the phone down beside him on the bench. His thumb tapped the folder once, then twice. Not in impatience, but in rhythm. There was no mistake. The number had not been deactivated. The file had not disappeared, but the system had quietly turned its face. When people like Colette or Devlin dismissed him in person, they at least had the courage to do it aloud. The phone tree had no such honesty. It was a maze designed to exhaust, not solve. A polite trap wrapped in efficiency. He sat still for another 7 minutes, then rose, then walked. Not toward home, not toward any formal office. He walked back across the street, back through the glass doors. The same security guard from before blinked in surprise, but said nothing. The receptionist, newer and unfamiliar, greeted him with a polite nod that quickly vanished when he gave his name. Her fingers tapped keys. Her eyes narrowed. Her shoulders stiffened. "Can you wait one moment, sir?" she asked, her voice suddenly wrapped in formality. She stepped into the side room labeled Internal Client Verification. Eldrick waited, hands clasped behind his back, gaze calm but alert. She returned less than a minute later, flustered now. "There seems to be a hold on your account. I need to check something." He said nothing. She turned the monitor slightly to one side, but not before Eldrick caught a glimpse, brief but unmistakable, of his own client profile on screen. The image on the screen was not the one he had submitted. It had been altered. His ID photo, once clear and crisp, now bore a red overlay across the center. 2 diagonal slashes that formed an X. Below it, in faint text, the status read, "Suspended referred to fraud unit." The receptionist turned the screen fully away and tried to smile, but her eyes betrayed her. "There might have been a system flag," she said softly. "Sometimes errors occur when a file is incomplete." Eldrick did not move. His breath did not quicken. But behind his eyes, the calculation began to shift. This wasn't administrative anymore. It was targeted. He understood now that the humiliation was not only emotional, it had metastasized into policy. They hadn't just denied him a seat. They had quietly exiled him from the system itself. He opened the folder in his lap with a calmness that no longer concealed disappointment, but signaled preparation. The call he made this time was not to the bank. It was to a woman named Eliza Trent, a senior investigative reporter for Dominion Finance Wire, a publication feared by institutions because it understood what most didn't, that the real stories weren't in press releases but in whispers, in denials, and in vanished names. Eliza answered on the second ring. Her voice was clipped, precise, impatient, until Eldrick gave his name. Then there was a pause, followed by a question. "Are you the same Eldrick Van listed as primary on the Vailbrook Trust?" Eldrick didn't answer directly. Instead, he said, "I think it's time someone asked why that trust hasn't moved in 15 years. That sentence rewired the morning. Within 24 hours, Eliza's research team was inside the archives. Not the public ones, but the ones scrubbed clean by legal departments who assumed time could bury shame. The Vailbrook Trust had been created by Elias R. Vailbrook, a late oil magnate turned education philanthropist who died with a final instruction few had ever understood, that his wealth not be inherited, but granted in full to a single individual of his choosing, someone unknown to the family, someone selected for resilience and vision, someone who would never be expected by the boardrooms now circling for scraps. That individual had been chosen 10 years ago. His name was Eldrick Van. The paperwork had been airtight, the selection process sealed. The trigger date for full activation had been 3 days ago. And yet, according to internal bank records, the account had been flagged, restricted, and quietly classified as fraudulent. Eliza's first article didn't ask questions. It issued warnings. $1 billion shadow. Who is Eldrick Van, and why is his inheritance locked? Splashed across every terminal in the city by noon. By evening, a second article followed, this time with names. Colette Granger, Lyndon Jorick, Devlin Maris, all named in internal memos referencing irregular interaction with non-profile clients. The emails were internal. They had not been leaked. They had been released by someone within compliance who had grown uneasy. By morning, it was no longer a story. It was a scandal. A voice recording surfaced. An old voicemail from Elias Vailbrook himself, sent to the trust's original legal architect. The voice was rasping with age but clear. When the time comes, I want no confusion. The capital does not go to heirs. It goes to Eldrick Van. He alone has authority. Any deviation is to be treated as theft. That recording alone was enough to open investigations. The SEC requested a transcript. The bank's board called an emergency meeting. But inside Grayson and Truitt, the panic was not over legality. It was over optics. Suddenly, the man they had ejected, mocked, and erased had become the only name that mattered. His presence now meant audit trails, reputational risk, legal exposure. But Eldrick had not spoken to the press. He had said nothing on record. He had not demanded apology or restitution, because he understood something deeper than vengeance. The silence of those who wronged him would become louder than any press release. The bank scrambled to adjust. They removed the red flag from his profile. They deleted internal alerts that marked him as a risk. They reassigned Colette to administrative leave. Devlin stopped coming into the office altogether. Compliance had no precedent, but everyone could feel it. That cold ripple of realization that something irreversible had occurred. On the surface, the lobby looked normal, marble still polished, coffee brewed, and light steady. But beneath that curated calm, the infrastructure of the bank had begun to implode. At exactly 7:12 a.m., an emergency code pushed through every floor. Tier 1 asset flag raised. Red status. Immediate containment. But there was no containment. The asset in question, $2.2 billion in liquid and diversified trust, had already moved. Every cent, every bond, every share had been extracted from the system in a legal, verified, and irrevocable transaction processed just past midnight. The recipient, Eldrick Van. The source, Vailbrook Trust. The authorization, absolute. The final node in the transaction chain was routed through an entity named Orlan Holdings, a shell company registered offshore, but fully owned by Eldrick himself. Within hours, Orlan Holdings announced a strategic acquisition, Grayson and Truitt's Class A voting shares. The purchase had been made quietly, legally, and fast enough that the board had only hours to respond before their majority position was diluted. No hostile takeover, no warning, just capital, moved with the precision of a man who had memorized every corridor they once tried to trap him in. And then, at 10 a.m. sharp, the doors to the executive conference hall opened. The same hall that once echoed with backslapping laughter, quiet strategy, and self-congratulation now filled with tension so thick it silenced even the most seasoned directors. Every seat was filled. Screens flickered to life. Legal counsels sat with notebooks open but said nothing. Eldrick entered without entourage, without press, without announcement. He wore the same coat from 2 days ago. The same calm, the same silence that had once made them feel powerful now made them nervous. The chairman cleared his throat, but before he could speak, a screen at the head of the room lit up with a single document, signed, sealed, time-stamped. A transfer of control. Eldrick Van, majority stakeholder. Beneath that, a clause executed from the original Vailbrook Trust Charter, granting not only equity ownership, but directive authority over any institution found complicit in obstructing rightful access to said estate. The chairman tried to speak again, voice strained, but Eldrick raised one hand, not to interrupt, but to signal something worse, a shift in narrative. "I was told this institution values transparency," he said quietly, then paused. "So let's begin with that." He clicked a remote and one by one, screens throughout the hall displayed internal messages. Emails marked confidential, flagged communications between Colette, Devlin, and Lyndon, all containing phrases like risk profile mismatch and probable impersonation based on appearance. The words hung in the air with a weight even the fluorescent lighting couldn't dilute. No one moved. No one denied. No one dared. Then came the next wave: financial behavior reports, internal tolerance protocols, and a redacted security memo warning of non-standard threats posing reputational exposure if allowed to escalate. At the bottom of that memo, one word had been manually scrawled in pen: Eldrick. The same name now stamped in ink atop the shareholder registry. The silence in the room was not reverent, it was terrified. Eldrick didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He walked to the center of the room and placed a folder on the main table. Inside were two documents: a motion to reorganize the board and a formal petition to transfer compliance oversight to an external ethics body. Both already signed, neither up for discussion. Not because they cared about justice, but because investors cared about liability. The headlines weren't forgiving. They weren't vague either. National trust scandal. Bank accused of racial profiling blocking $2.2 billion estate. Beneath the headline, photos surfaced, grainy security captures from lobby footage leaked by whistleblowers, showing Eldrick standing alone, hands folded, face still. While staff looked away, guards loomed close, and employees laughed nearby. In those still frames, the arrogance of their silence was visible, immortalized without defense. At the center of this unfolding reckoning was Colette Granger, the teller whose disdain had launched the first domino. She had not returned to work since the day Eldrick walked out, but now she didn't need to. Her termination was announced live during the bank's emergency press briefing. Her name printed in bold beneath the subtitle, "Immediate Personnel Action Taken." The spokesperson spoke carefully, deliberately, eyes unblinking as cameras recorded every word. Effective immediately, Ms. Granger is no longer employed by Grayson and Truitt. Her behavior does not reflect the values of this institution or its stakeholders. The phrase, "or its stakeholders," wasn't an accident. It was a coded acknowledgement of Eldrick's new role, not only as victim, but as authority. News outlets picked it up instantly. They plastered her name next to the words misconduct and racial insensitivity, and soon even her professional licensing board opened an inquiry into her pattern of discriminatory behavior. Her past records, once buried under procedural delays, now resurfaced, warnings filed but never acted upon, clients whose complaints were dismissed. Co-workers who had remained silent now came forward with trembling statements about a culture they were too afraid to challenge. Devlin Maris didn't speak to reporters. He didn't need to. A single leak, a clipped internal email from him that read, "He looks like he wandered in from a bus stop," in reference to Eldrick, spread like wildfire. Investors demanded his resignation before compliance could prepare a response. His desk was cleared by noon. His office badge revoked by 2. In the boardroom, a different kind of reckoning unfolded. Lyndon Jorick, the man who once denied Eldrick a seat and offered him a suggestion to dress better, now sat in the same glass conference room under a suspension order. His history, long thought protected, now lay exposed on an overhead projector. HR complaints, diversity training absences, internal notes from junior staff citing persistent microaggressions. But the real damage came from a single document dated 6 years prior, a formal reprimand for inappropriate commentary regarding client demographic risk profiling, buried by an executive who had since retired. That document, once hidden, now looped across news channels as a symbol of systemic failure. The regulatory body launched a formal investigation. Public interest groups filed motions demanding transparency in hiring and promotion practices. Shareholders threatened class action litigation for reputational damage. Eldrick said nothing. Not to reporters, not to cameras, not to the board. He didn't have to. Every headline that began with his silence now ended with their collapse. The staff who once laughed now passed security checkpoints with hunched shoulders and darting eyes. Training sessions were mandated. Sensitivity briefings scheduled. But none of it mattered. Not really. Because the cost had already been paid, not by the victims, but by the perpetrators. For the first time in the bank's modern history, the institution was being reshaped not from the inside, but from above. In the weeks that followed the collapse of the old order at Grayson and Truett, a strange silence took hold. Not the silence of suppression or denial, but one of reckoning. The media storm slowed. The lawsuits settled into legal rhythms. The protesters outside the marble steps thinned as accountability turned from outrage into consequence. Inside the institution, change wasn't only structural, it became human. It began quietly, far from microphones and courtrooms, in the form of an unexpected knock on a modest brownstone door on the west side of the city. The door opened to reveal Eldrick Vann, standing not in the boardroom armor of suits and titles, but in the simple stillness that had always defined him. On the doorstep stood Colette Granger, no longer in uniform, no longer insulated by title or gait. She looked older than the days before the scandal, not in years, but in weight. In her hands was a letter, not typed but handwritten. The ink trembled slightly at the bottom as she handed it to him, and spoke words she had never rehearsed, words she had avoided most of her life. She said she was sorry, not just for the things she did, but for the person she had become while doing them. She said she remembered watching her father be fired from a warehouse job when she was young, humiliated by someone who never looked him in the eye, and how she swore she'd never be like the people who turned their backs. And yet, somewhere along the climb, she had become one of them, and didn't even notice until it was too late. Her voice cracked when she admitted, "You reminded me of him." And I hated that. Eldrick didn't offer forgiveness because she hadn't asked for permission to be redeemed. What he offered instead was space, the kind that wasn't filled with absolution, but with understanding. Not all wounds heal clean, but some can scar into something that still allows a person to walk forward. Days later, the bank's new initiative launched, not as a PR campaign, but as a structural investment. Eldrick didn't call it inclusion or outreach. He called it what it needed to be, correction. The first program, funded by the redirected dividends of the Valebrook Trust, wasn't for expansion or branding. It was for education. He created a scholarship fund specifically for staff within the banking sector who had been flagged for professional misconduct tied to bias, negligence, or exclusion. It wasn't a punishment. It was a test. Those who had once judged would now be asked to study what they had failed to see. And at the launch event, when asked what the program would be called, Eldrick didn't hesitate. He replied, "Second chances for the lost." A pause followed. Then he added, "Because we're all lost at some point. What matters is who wants to find their way back." The name stuck. Even in its plainness, it carried weight. Lyndon Jorick applied. Not immediately, but quietly months later, after resigning from the industry and disappearing from the headlines. His essay began with one sentence: "Power had always protected me until it didn't." Devlin did not apply. He moved out of state and never spoke to the press. Colette, however, enrolled in full, not as a gesture, but as a plea to rebuild. She graduated the program with distinction and joined a nonprofit offering financial literacy to underserved communities. She did not lead the sessions. She sat in the back and listened. Eldrick never once took credit. He never gave interviews. He returned to his quiet office, now at the helm of a foundation that did not bear his name, but whose mission carried his mark. He walked through the same streets where he had once been watched with suspicion, now passed by faces that didn't always recognize him, but sometimes paused with the ghost of something like respect. In a cafe not far from a bank, he saw the young trainee who once tossed the janitorial flyer at him. The boy looked up from behind the counter, froze for a moment, and then muttered an apology too soft for anyone else to hear. Eldrick nodded. That was enough, because the truth had never needed volume to be felt. It only needed to be known. By the year's end, Grayson and Truett no longer resembled what it once was. The walls still stood, The marble still gleamed. But within it, policies had changed, faces had shifted, and the air no longer tasted of quiet arrogance. It now carried something different: responsibility. Eldrick Van, the man they once tried to erase, had not only returned. He had rebuilt the stage and handed the microphone to those who were willing to admit they had failed. Not because he was kind, not because he was vengeful, but because he understood what institutions never could: that justice isn't loud, and dignity doesn't demand attention. They simply wait until those who ignored them have no choice but to see the end. If this story moved you, let us know by hitting the like button and subscribing so you never miss the next twist. We want to hear from you. What part of Eldrick's journey hit the hardest? Which moment made you stop and think? And where in the world are you watching from today? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We're reading every single one.